So in this lecture, we're going to take a look at the idea of inequality. And in any free market system, you're going to have some level of income and wealth inequality. And so we're going to talk about the causes of those, causes of wealth inequality, the causes of income inequality, and then we'll finish with a little bit of information about the poverty threshold and how we measure poverty, and then how we actually measure inequality, when that's something called a Gini Coefficient, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail. So the first thing to observe about inequality in terms of wealth and income is that we're talking about two different things here. Wealth inequality is the differences in value of a people's capital assets. That's to say, like, what they own minus what they owe. So these are things like the stocks that they own, the value of their stocks, their bonds, but also their real estate. And we can also throw in some of their personal property here as well. And what we'd find is that that is saying that maybe the top 20% of American households who might have, say, 90% of the wealth. Now, these numbers that I'm giving you, I'll show you an accurate data here in just a second. But what we're saying here is that if you were to measure out, right, if you were to measure out all of the people in the United States, and you had kind of 20% of the people, of the households in the United States. So this is 20%, that's 20%, 20%, 20, and 20. And you said, how much does the top 20% control in terms of wealth? That helps us determine versus, say, the bottom 20% or the middle 20%. That helps us determine how unequal is that wealth distribution. For income inequality, we're actually talking about the difference among wages, but sometimes this also includes income, and income from, and we'd say stocks, and so that's called dividends or capital gains. Dividends and capital gains. Capital gains, it'd be nice if I could spell today. Dividends and capital gains. You might have the income from that real estate, right, from property, and we'd call that rent that you get as income, rent. So this would be like as the rental income, or you might have income from your bonds, and that might be interest income as well. So if we kind of added up all the different kinds of income and we applied the same notion of the top 20% of households get this much income and the bottom 20% get this much income, we could kind of make some comparisons about unequal distributions of wealth or income. Now, one thing to know is, again, in a free market system, we're going to have some level of income and wealth inequality. But what we find is that it's pretty different. It's pretty different for the amount of wealth and income that each of these quintiles would have, and that's partly why we're watching that film in class, Inequality for All. So the first thing that I want to show you is actually this graph from Piketty and Saez, and this is a graph that's actually in the film, but you can see here that the top 10% pre-tax income share in the United States, 1912 to 2000, or 1917 to 2012. And these are from income tax returns. And we can see that the top 10% of Americans were getting about 40 to 50% of the income of the United States in the 1920s. And that during the latter part of the Great Depression, right, the 1930s, and then really continuing through World War II and the decades afterwards, the top 10% of American households were getting around 30 to 35% of the American wealth. And then starting around 1981, that number ticks up dramatically. And we can see here that the top 10% of American households now are earning 50% of the American wealth, or the American income. So this idea is saying that 90% of Americans, right, the bottom 90%, are earning the same as the top 10%. So that's one aspect of our income shares. And then one additional graph to show you, I think we couldn't be economics without graphs, is the top 0.1%, right? So this is saying the very tip top, almost, right? We can disaggregate this one even among a little bit even more detail. But the top 0.1% income share, and in 2012 that means you were earning more than about $2 million, are earning more than 10% of the American income. So really, this is a very, very concentrated amount of wealth, and you can see that it of income. I'm going to keep getting those two words confused. You can see the same pattern, right? That it's relatively large concentration here in the 1920s. It falls dramatically in the 1930s, then even greater in the 1940s with income shares, and then it falls even further in the late 1960s until starting around 1981. It starts to rise again, and it is today right about 10 to 12%. So even here in 2019. So let's talk a little bit then about some of this issue of causes of wealth inequality, which is different from income, but it is a related concept. So this idea is that historically speaking, capital, that's to say the stuff you own, right, your assets that you own, your stocks, your bonds, your real estate, grows at a rate of about 4 to 5% a year. And income rates have grown at about 1 to 2% a year. So historically, capital grows a little faster than income, actually about twice as fast or even more. High income households, and this has been true for decades, can and do save more of this income that they get than low income. And so they're putting their money into this capital bucket. As the high income people save their income, it becomes capital. And in the absence of redistribution through taxes, capital shocks like wars and recessions, high income households increasingly become high wealth households. And so what we've seen is that higher income, right, there's been an increase in income to the high income, to high earners. And that's an important aspect here of what's happening since the 1970s, is that there's more and more income going to the high earners, and that is actually, they're taking that income, they're putting it into capital, and then it's growing even faster and faster. So what we find is that actually the United States' wealth inequality is even greater than its income inequality. And at root, the primary cause of our wealth inequality, although we have these absence of these things, is actually higher income going to higher earners. So a quick little graph to show you what that looks like. So this shows you the changes in real incomes by household by the share of the country that they have. So here's what we're saying here. Starting in 1980, if we set it to 100, right? If we set that to 100, the bottom 90% of Americans have actually lost real income since 1980. So you can see here, starting at 1980, right? That's this line, 100. They've kind of bebopped around at basically the same income, and they're a little bit below where they were in 1980. The average, though, is a little bit higher, and then you can really start to see that for these high income folk, like top 10%, top 1%, top 0.1, top 0.01, their income has risen really fast, has risen really dramatically. So you can see that basically the top 0.01% are earning 4 times as much income in 2014 as they were in 1980. The top 0.1% of Americans are earning nearly 3 times as much income as they were in 1980. And this is in real income, so it's adjusted for inflation. The top 10% of Americans are earning 1.5 to 2 times as much income as they did in 1980, but the bottom 90% of Americans are staying the same. So these folks here in these groups are able to take most of their higher incomes and they dump them into capital. When that happens, that capital grows faster and faster than even the income changes do. And so what we're seeing is that this bottom pool of folks is being left behind. Now we can see before 1980 or so that actually these groups typically moved in tandem. They moved together. And so we can find that this is a really dramatic shift that's only started to happen in the last 40 years or so. Now, why, right? Let's talk a little bit about why there's changes in income inequality. So we've already talked in this class that marginal productivity theory says that labor's paid the equilibrium value of the MRP and the MFC. So there are two kind of underlying things that might support that this is really explaining why we're seeing such a divergence in income inequality. One is that certain workers who are more productive are getting paid more. So you could make the argument that because maybe that top 10% of Americans is simply just 4 times as productive, or 3 times as productive, or 2 times as productive, and so therefore they're being paid more for more talent, more training, credentials, and so forth that signal their productivity. There are some good pieces of evidence to suggest that the folks who are in those top groups are more productive. However, it doesn't really follow that something happened in 1980 or so that would really drive that. There's nothing really that suggests why. The second piece that would support the marginal productivity theory is something called compensating differentials. And this is the idea that we pay more to certain workers to induce them to work because they work in an undesirable job. So people who work night shifts or dangerous work are sometimes paid more to compensate for the different types of work that they're doing. Again, this is going to be part of the marginal productivity theory, but it's not necessarily going to be what's driving those higher levels of income inequality. Here's some other explanations for income or wage inequality. There's something called efficiency wages, that firms pay higher wages to motivate their workers and reduce turnover because that's very costly. Again, this isn't necessarily directly tied to marginal productivity theory, but it may not necessarily explain why we're seeing such a dramatic rise. Discrimination. There are certain firms that pay differences based on race, gender, and ethnicity, although this is, we would say, illegal, and it does not help them profit maximize, right, and stupid. So we can say illegal and stupid. But what we do find is that there is some evidence that a lot of firms do that. Firms will essentially try to hold down wages by using these tools. The third one here, weak labor power. Now this one is probably a reason why that bottom 90% hasn't grown. The decreased union membership is actually a pretty significant factor since the 1970s. The United States' private labor force that's been unionized, the percentage has fallen and fallen. And in fact, there are the percentage of workers who are in unions today is actually lower than when unions were largely illegal in the United States. So this, though, has the effect of lowering wages for both unionized and non-unionized workers, because the non-unionized workers' wages are boosted whenever the union wages are higher. So if the union workers are getting paid $20 an hour, a lot of times those non-union workers will get paid something close to it, because the employers are kind of are responding to the pressures of that market. So the fact that we have declining union membership is actually affecting even the non-union workers, and that's an important one that a lot of folks don't often see. The last piece here is that a weak redistributionist system has really taken hold in the United States since the 1980s, and we have some pretty strong inequality in our post-tax incomes. And what we find is if we compare that to other more developed countries, the United States does not have very much redistribution. Now, this is not the same, right? This word does not equal socialism. So we should maybe observe a point here that you can have a redistributionist system and not be a socialist country. Redistribution simply could mean that our tax rates are set such that we can collect government revenue to invest in things like higher education, generally speaking, pre-K education, infrastructure spending, and job training programs, things that will essentially improve the economic outcomes of the workforce. So these are not necessarily things that we're saying like just take the rich's money and give it to the poor. This is more like saying we should be investing in things that will actually improve the productivity of labor, right? We need talent, training, and signaling to boost the wages, so why don't we spend our money on those things? Well, in many states, we've found it harder and harder to do that. Here in our home state of Missouri, the higher education budget has essentially been flat or low for 20 years. And these higher education public universities are struggling for funding. And so that is because we aren't taking money and saying we're going to spend money on those things. So that's going to cut into the talent, training, and signaling of the large portion of the labor pool. Now, the last part that we're going to talk about today is poverty, and then how we measure inequality. So the idea of poverty wasn't really measured in the United States until after the 1960s, after the 1950s. It's actually defined by the post-tax household income per person. So I'm going to show you a chart of what that actually means. So this is the 2018 poverty thresholds, and here's how we read it. If we said that you have one person and you're living all by yourself, you have a weighted average of the thresholds, and this is really just saying like this is what the number is. If you earned and you were single by yourself and your post-tax, so this would be all the transfers, all the welfare payments, everything, under $12,784 in a year, you live in poverty. And if you are under age 65, if you earned under 13,000, you lived in poverty. Now, this would assume, obviously, if you're the only person, that you don't have any children. So this is none. If you had two people in your household and you were under 65 and you had one child, and so it was you and your one child, you would need 17,308. And if you were above that, you don't live in poverty. If you're below that, you live in poverty. Now, one thing that's an issue, these numbers are true for the entire United States. So this doesn't take into account different costs of living. And you could imagine that someone living in the South Bronx or here in St. Louis or in Los Angeles earning $17,000 a year would make it really, really hard. Imagine somebody earning $20,000 a year. It would be very difficult to get by. But if they were earning $20,000 as one person plus one kid, they're not in poverty. So there's arguments that our poverty structure here, the way we count people living in poverty, undercounts people. If you have, for example, 3 people and it's you and 2 kids, then you need $20,231. And again, that's a flat rate whether you're living in rural Iowa, whether you're living in rural New Mexico, or in downtown Los Angeles. That's the number. So we've been using these numbers for some time, since the 1960s, and the numbers get adjusted every year. What we found is that, generally speaking, regardless of U.S. growth rates or economic conditions, poverty remains relatively stable. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit to show you this one. You can see that during recessions, these recession bar indicators, the number of people living in poverty does rise. Right? So you can see here in a major recession in the early 80s, it rose. And you can see that the poverty rate rises a little bit during these recessions, and you can see it rose to about 15% in the years or so after the last recession. The poverty rate's a little bit lower now than 14.8%. I want to say it's right around 12%, maybe even a little lower. But you can see that before really 1965, right? Before 1965, the poverty rate was much higher, and that's because before 1965 or so, the U.S. government wasn't really doing anything to address the concerns of poverty. We have these series of programs in the 1960s that are kind of often mocked today as the quote-unquote war on poverty. But what we can see is that these programs have generally kept the poverty rate below 15%. And in the years before that, the poverty rate was quite high. And the evidence suggests that, yes, helping people with certain supports of housing and food does help them stay out of poverty. It's literally keeping people from going hungry. So we're gonna kind of observe one last thing here: poverty rates by age, and we can see that before the 1960s, it's more of an estimate, right? But afterwards, we can observe that one of the key things that's held true is that people under age 18 are usually the ones who have the highest poverty rates. So the percentage of kids in poverty is about 1 in 5. Now, let me talk briefly about what it means to actually live in poverty. Where these numbers come from, like these poverty numbers, it actually comes from the 1950s. They made an estimate that said that people who were poor spent about 1/3 of their income on food, right? 1/3 of their income on food. And so what they did is, in the 1960s, they said, well, let's figure out what's the basic minimal amount of food in the most basic caloric requirements to not starve to death. Okay, and then what's the cost of that basket of food? And then let's multiply that by 3, and that's what the poverty rate is. So it's essentially, it's derived from this notion of get the most basic caloric requirements met. How much does that cost multiplied by 3? Now, so let's say that in the 1950s, your food cost maybe $1,000 a year for the most basic basket. Times 3, the poverty rate is 3,000. And that number this internal thing has never been readjusted. They've essentially just been adjusting the 3,000 upwards since then. What we found, though, is that since the 1960s, the 1/3 of the budget going to food is no longer true. That in fact, it's only about maybe 1/6 of the budget goes to food now, because food prices are actually cheaper. But this hasn't kept up with the fact that housing costs are higher, childcare costs are higher, medical costs are much higher. And so what we're doing is we're undercounting the number of people who are in poverty. So there is some evidence that suggests that maybe what we've been doing since the 1990s is undercounting the population in poverty. Now circle back for a second. 1 out of 5 children is still living in poverty under even this really artificially low definition. It's possible, quite possible, that we're really talking more about folks who are, in terms of struggling, we're talking about 30 to 40% of the children in this country. But at a bare minimum, it's 20% of the kids in this country are barely able to make it. And it does predominantly affect children. Now, we can see that there's some other groups that poverty is concentrated in. It's heavily concentrated in Native American households, African American households, Hispanic households. It would necessarily be concentrated in single earner households, because if you don't have 2 incomes and you're trying to raise kids in a single income, that can be pretty tough. But some of the highest poverty rates, if we really want to be honest with ourselves, are Native Americans and single earner African American and Hispanic households. The last thing that we're going to talk about in this video, and I know it's been a little bit long, but it's important, is something called the Gini Coefficient. And so in this one, what I want to show you is how we calculate it and what it means. So what we're really saying is, if you can imagine basically a distribution showing the ratio of the percent of households to the percent of income or wealth. So we'll kind of draw a quick one here, and we'll say this is the percent of the population, and this is the percent of the income. So we could do it with income or with wealth. Now, a perfectly equal distribution would say that 50% of the income goes to 50% of the population, right? 50% of the income to 50% of the population. And we might say that 25% goes to 25% of the population. And that once you all the way get up to 100, you get to 100% of the population. So a perfectly equal distribution would just be a straight line that looks like that. Now, we don't expect that, right? It's a free market system where some people are more productive, some people are going to earn more than others. So what we would expect, though, is something that looks kind of like this, where as you get closer to that top 1% of Americans, they earn more and more of a percent of the income. So we can say that, for example, that here you've got maybe the top, if this is 90%, right? If that's 90, the top 90% actually earning, the bottom 90%, let me slow down here, the bottom 90% of people would earn 50% of the income. And the top 10% of people, the people who go from here to here, right, they earn the other 50% of the income. So this is kind of a plot showing the income distribution of the United States. And there are many different versions, but this is generally called the Lorenz curve, after the first person who kind of set one up. Now, if we find the area between the curve and the perfect straight line, and we call that A, and then we draw a line straight down from here and we call that B, the area beneath the curve down that way, and that's B. The Gini coefficient, right, the Gini coefficient is equal to A divided by A plus B. And essentially, what it tells us is that a higher number, a higher Gini equals increased inequality. Okay? Increased inequality. And so a really high Gini would be an indication that maybe the area of A is quite large. So imagine if you had, for example, another one off to the side here, where the area of A was really big and B was kind of small. Right? If A was really big and B was small, then we would expect that actually the Gini would be very high. If on the other hand, the area of A was very small, and B was really big, you would expect the Gini to be low and inequality to be quite low, because it's a lot closer to that income distribution that's the perfectly equally distributed. So a slightly bigger version of this that I want to show you, so you can see instead of my graph, is this one here. And being able to interpret a Gini is important. You may also be asked to interpret different Lorenz curves. So if you're shown different Lorenz curves, if the curve is closer up to this line, then it's going to be more of an equal distribution. Now, of course, one last graph. The income Gini ratio of households in the United States here, starting in the 1980s, once again, it went from about 0.37 all the way up to today. It's actually a little bit even higher than this. It's about 0.46. And that's a substantial increase. Most other more developed countries are slightly more, and some of them have stayed flat even through this entire time. So the United States is different in terms of how we have had a change in terms of our inequality. So hopefully this helps you understand some of the issues related to inequality and wealth, and I'll see you next time.